Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. I did press in, right? I did. Okay, there we go.
Allow me a moment to entertain.
Oof, this is gonna be hard. I was not thinking of starting on Zaku at like moment 1, but I have already played somewhat for today, and I have had some time for my hands to rest since that, so let's go. Welcome Cocoa Caramel. And my brain trying to rush through everything I remember about this matchup, particularly at the Platinum tier, though you never know what a person's actual skill level is until you've watched them a little bit, so we know they're at least Platinum, which is probably going to be rough. Let's go.
Round 1. Fight.
We are having our usual Mish-Mash Monday Battle Lounge. And that means you should be expecting to have as much fun, let's say, as usual. This is a let's call it Atlantic Rim Battle Lounge. So, if you are anywhere on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, or have particularly good connections anywhere in the Midwestern US, feel free to join in. Ooh, I thought I had actually gotten out of that one. Good horizontal there. Lots of rethinking that situation altogether. Got out of range perfectly. And perfect slide. Today we're not specifically looking at or training anything in particular that I'm aware of. Although this player is reminding me of what exactly I like to do in this matchup, at least. I need to be more ready for that. But we've got the usual problem of an opponent who backs away from me a lot. So, if I would like to solve this and actually have a chance at winning, then I have to be even more specific about how I fight them. This is, as I constantly complain, a fairly common thing that happens in Street Fighter. As you get better at offense, players obviously would want to spend less time in your offensive range. And it does take a while before players reach the level of understanding that your offense can be good enough that backing off and waiting for you to make standard mistakes isn't enough. Now, I'm not saying that I made none, but this is definitely one closer to that situation because this player has had to use a lot more of their actual offense skills against me compared to most. But optimally here, for example, I should give them their space now. Why should I do that? Because from the winning the match perspective, it's just easier to do that when the opponent is giving me all the space to do it with. You can see that they're not entirely confident in even their more tricky attacks, but that's partially probably a Chun-Li thing, because she can stop a lot of stuff, even while she's advancing. That was good though. I think I would have missed that one otherwise. That move is plus now. There we go. So now we're seeing a bunch of relatively well thought out offense relative to my character's options. They're still working on understanding all of it, but we've got more or less offenses coming now. Means I have to think about what exactly will deal with it. And this is not Zeku offense that I'm familiar with, because most Zeku never play offense against me. So it gets a good opportunity to learn something. I'm immediately I think I'm gonna try heavy kick stuff. Or pake stuff, depending. This is wasting a lot of meter, I honestly must say. I normally wouldn't say that about a player, but yeah, this is honestly wasting meter. However, it is pretty valid. Like, if you were in a tournament, you'd want to do this because stressing out your opponent, making them think that they have to catch up with you, making them think, oh no, I'm going to lose, putting them on tilt in some way is your best option generally. But I think I held up decently. I didn't actually have to deal with their offense in any way that mattered to me, so it's all good. But good flow from them. Oh, looks like they're gone already. Good flow from them regardless, because they were definitely going to keep that up and at a level where I definitely don't have that matchup practiced to that level, and Chun-Li doesn't necessarily have the tools for dealing with it when someone has that level of awareness. I would have to be constantly using up all of my meter to get out of the situation, or potentially using more weird V-reversal setups to get out, neither of which I was particularly interested in doing, therefore it would have been a good way to keep on playing that overwhelming style. I'm really interested to see what that matchup looks like with a Zeku that plays like that at some point in the future. But I'm not the one going to combo breaker this year, so. This brings us back to in-team matches, and I'm not really sure how good the connections to the other people in the lounge are going to be.
Show you the divide in our class.
But obviously, you've seen this match if you are a fan of this channel many times. What you may not have seen is the fact that our Kareen has not been playing on stream in a while, but she's been still getting most of her flow in at different other times. So it's not entirely that she's had much less practice than the rest of us. Of course, that's not saying a lot because we practice this game like once a week. Currently, building up other fundamentals in different places.
Round 2. Fight.
The lounge is already almost full. I think it might actually be full since I think someone just joined to replace the Zeku that left. But I'm still kind of expecting people to leave quite quickly, and there's probably at least some chance of someone like backing out of their spot, depending on what else is going on. So if you hop in now, you'll probably get some matches, and if you're quite good, chances are you'll be able to keep that going for a while. We're expecting to see more people this time simply because it is a win 10 Battle Lounge matches week, which tends to result in stronger players showing up. On the other hand, I guess that's not necessarily the outcome they might want.
Round 1.
Since as the team improves, the fact that the ranks don't necessarily represent as much as you might expect means that you'll end up not being sure whether or not you would in fact keep on winning, or at least if you do keep on winning, you usually have to do it in some ways that some people prefer not to play. So it's better to go off and try to get those against someone who could probably use more matchup experience, or just play the game and see if you can find someone strong enough to just be a match for you regardless, so that you're gaining more while playing. Because I don't think I taught the Zeku very much.
I'll admit that you have some skill.
Round 2. Fight.
That said, it's also a fairly useful way to get extra experience, especially if you don't think you have something ready. Just let people know you're either fighting a serious match or specifically going for a specific matchup and see what happens. Someone will often join in even if they don't necessarily play that character as a main, and higher level players are often looking for opportunities to play at the mid or lower levels, looking for someone to fight against with a character that they are making themselves familiar with.
Cutting wins.
There's not a whole lot of ways to get that level of interaction, since the adaptability is not quite enough. Bots will do it to a point, but if you're getting used to a new character and want to see what other people think of the way you play that character, obviously a bot is random, it will never tell you anything. The best you can do is to learn some interactions between moves and whatever part of the matchup you've decided is important. This is weird corner guard, but it technically works because of the way that Karina and Akali interact. That there, what you've just seen, is one of Akali's weirdest weaknesses. Most characters in this game have a good option with which to hit you after a throw tech. But one of the things I learned really early on in this game is that for whatever reason, Akali seems to lack one. And I'm pretty confident that he basically lacks a good one altogether. So being relatively aggressive on Akali as a character, in the realm of going for throw, as long as you don't get uppercut out of that throw, chances are you've got some control of the situation because he generally doesn't manage to hit. Whereas, if he does try to hit, there's often situations in which it just works out in your favor instead. there are a lot of whiff punishes that a lot of characters have available to them after that throw tech. The sweep being so relatively quick and good in other ways means that it had to have a downside somewhere, and the downside appears to be range.
Final round. Fight.
But this isn't exactly the problem, as Cammy has a similar situation, but she has other moves, quicker speed in specific ways. She'll get around the problem more easily than Nikali will. Maybe there's a solution I don't necessarily know. Most things I'm aware of get interrupted though. One important thing to think about when in this sort of match, therefore, when you are pushing on your opponent consistently, is to consider whether or not you actually want to chase them in particular situations, and whether or not their retreat was meant to make you get into a range where they could jump at you, for example. That's a more common tactic than a lot of others, but even for characters like Nikali, there's probably more than that. Yep, we are all full. And I have no idea what most of these matches, what these connections are going to be like. Because those bars mean nothing. So hopefully our Kareen has a better connection to this player than it appears that they might have. My voice is still weird, I'm told, which is probably not so great, but this is one of those streams where you probably don't need to pay much attention to what I'm saying.
Round one.
Well, I can't see from here. Really hard to say. Ooh, went in too close there. Ken is normally easier to corner guard from further away despite his options. Not as easy to corner guard as Akuma, because he has more options than Akuma, but you generally don't want to be that close, because once Ken starts hitting you, then he really doesn't have to stop. And if the lag is bad, then that's even worse. Just don't try to control Ken from there. Especially not with a Footsie's character like Kareen, where you don't really have to care. Ken can't necessarily clear the space between you and him to get, for example, a good crouching medium kick or something, without you probably being able to see it. Even in lag, it would probably be visible. Ken normally benefits from this by being able to just, let's go with YOLO, his way out of certain situations, and having massive corner carries so that he's not normally the one under this problem. He's so good at maintaining mid-screen positions even when you block certain things that it just doesn't come up.
Final round. Fight.
But it's again one of those things where you have to think about the match from the perspective of not how can I avoid being hit, but rather how can I avoid taking much damage. Not taking damage, much damage. Because Ken jumping at you is anti-airable in most situations, and Ken players are not necessarily going to default to playing footsies if they don't have to, because it's just not in their best interest at all. So, if you expect to be dealing with footsies Ken, make them prove that they're a footsies Ken, and will have the skill to walk their way out of the corner against you, instead of, you know, just staying right outside their range, preferably at a spot where they can't hit with much. And your character, in this case Kareen, has multiple options there. It looks like it was in fact too laggy for the rematch. I wonder where they are. But given the flag, I honestly can't tell you, and those flags don't generally mean anything anyway, so we move on. That means we have one slot open, and again, there's possibilities of people shuffling around if you think you want to get matches later. Might be a good idea to try to get in now. And expect to need to chat back in about 10 minutes maybe. See if anyone like skipped out and your turn ended up closer. And now we're around to the matchup that I don't think either of these players, strictly speaking, enjoys this matchup, but they really need to keep practice on it, and they both know it, as this matchup seems to happen to them a lot online. And while the playstyle doesn't usually match up, remembering all of the little things you could do differently is better to prepare for stronger players of the same character, the players who don't necessarily start from where we start. In general, group starts from fundamentals, footsies, those sorts of things, and pressure tends to be lacking. Defense can also be lacking. Tends to be the thing we work on second in games. But the fact that many other players don't do it that way, they perfect their combos, perfect their pressure, make sure they can keep control of the match without the opponent getting a chance to do that for as long as possible. But if you do learn how to defend your way through that, it's not as if most players just immediately fold and crumble. Some do, but many of them just go, oh, I have to actually fight now, and then they just turn on that part of their mind. And it's super important to be able to just deal with that immediately. So, it's double-edged. Fighting each other will nearly never lead to the standard gains. You won't necessarily become able to fight the similarly ranked online Kareen or Akuma, because their focus may be very different. That would come around at higher ranks, mostly because people who have time to practice both the pressure game and the footsies don't tend to be a silver. But at the end of the day, you still have to learn to deal with both sides. So you might as well take what you can get. Since the better you get at dealing with this side, the more likely it is that even if your opponent didn't fold outright, you may be able to keep up with whatever else it is that they try to do, enough to make the match much more even. Another good aspect of this is learning to deal with meter usage and technically forcing meter usage. Both of these characters have relatively strange times in which they use their meter. You can use it to extend combos, but a lot of the time that isn't a massive increase in damage. It's more so one of those things you do toward the end of a match that you probably won already. Facing someone with high enough defense, aside from that moment where Karine gets a raw increase in damage from EX Tenko, a lot of the stuff she ends up doing is very get out of jail free situations or trickery in neutral. I know I've seen Orochi, EX Orochi used in special ways, but I nearly never see it anymore. Which confuses me honestly, but the move is negative. We explicitly have a bot to teach you how to punish it because it is negative. And you have to get used to the idea that when you see this move, unlike Orochi itself, where you have to at least think about if there's a mix-up coming, in the other case, you should definitely immediately try to figure out what am I going to get best out of this punish now. No stun. Patiently out, but I think that was probably a missed execution.
Final round. Fight. Karine wins. Let's do this.
It is noisy outside today. And for that reason, I basically turn off the mic whenever I can and give you much less to worry about.
I'll show you the divide in our class. Boom! That's how you start the fight and finish it.
Though I'm told that the noise cancelling on this mic is pretty good. The bitrate may leave a lot to be desired, but at least the noise cancelling works out well. honestly, this is probably not the best practice that we could be using before any tournament, as it's a bit harder to get through pools, technically. It depends on who's in your pool, of course. If you know that you have a high-ranked player as your first match for some reason, definitely train with your close friends or with the fastest thinking person you can find, because most high-ranked players do think very quickly, they adapt very quickly. But it's not the greatest for dealing with even relatively good players who are not tournament winning level. Because then, even when they're normally good, the nerves can make people lock up and try to go back to much more minimalistic strategies. This happens to a lot of people. When you don't have like years and years of constant tournament experience under your belt, confusing things happening is itself a threat to your performance. I have very strong memories of one unfortunate Dalsim who faced Omni in a tournament and just basically got blown up. Not because they were playing Dalsim particularly poorly at all, but because of a specific thing Omni can do due to practice that just stops a very, very specific Dalsim setup. And it's so consistent that they just went, I don't know what to do here. This is the way I get damage when things are on the line, and I don't have any meter, but I keep on getting blown up for this. And stopping yourself from doing your extremely practiced go-to in that situation can be really hard. And as far as I saw from their match, that's what they ended up telling their friends after. I couldn't make myself not do this, and that was it. It was literally not related to anything specific about the matchup, anything specific about the outplay. I mean, there were definitely outplay rounds, but the actual I have control of this, but now I've dropped it, now I've lost it, was just because of, yeah, this always works, and now it absolutely doesn't work. Obviously the massive damage it does also doesn't help, but the problem therefore is that you can actually end up losing two people who slow down a lot because you are thinking about all the things you could be doing, trying to, let's say, work your way through, figure them out, but they're thinking about doing exactly one thing, and therefore by the time your brain has gone through all of the calculations of, okay, so I've done this 2 times, which means my opponent is going to do this thing, but they know that I could do this thing instead because I have meter, so they'll be expecting me to do that thing, so they'll do this other thing instead, which is usually a bad idea. When they're just thinking, I'll just do the 3rd thing again because I don't know what else to do here. And then you die. At least against zoners, this isn't generally so bad, except for you, who is now, like, furiously fast in that way.
Final round. Fight.
In Ryu's case, it's generally that Ryu is able to switch rapidly from I'm zoning you to I'm attacking now in a way that I don't think any other zoner in this game can actually do. It depends on if you perceive what Claw does as zoning. But generally not even Falk does it. Because the problem with dealing with Falk is that she is somewhat an unfamiliar character to a lot of people, even now. But if you know most of Falk's ways of setting up situations when she decides to go on offense, she's still not a terribly strong character on offense. Okay, let's see who is behind me in line.
It's go time.
I'll let it rock. If they're not around, then no loss to me. Hopefully this is not terrible connection-wise. These ping numbers, they mean nothing.
Let's
I even call them numbers because I'm used to thinking them of as numbers, but it's just bars now. On the other hand, I am glad that they did that because the fluctuation seems to be so much more important than anything related to the number of bars. Also, there's a misrepresentation somewhere because I think I have a limitation on this where you can't join unless you are at least 2, but people still manage to get in anyway. So I'm going to assume there's something to do with general long-term average measures, or it's just broken.
That's how you start the fight and finish it quickly.
Ashura costume and all. Definitely hoping it's decent connection now. But I didn't see enough of the first round to assume that this situation had anything to do with connection. So,
Round 2. Fight.
okay, let's see. Okay, that moment makes me assume that the lag is bad. Because that's a matter of not being able to time the follow-up to the dash, which is almost impossible to mess up on your own, except if you flinch because of strange behaviors in the lag itself. But I still can't be sure because I'm not the one fighting. You can't necessarily assume that because there was no... I think you're supposed to be able to back jump over that. But again, could be like...
Kage wins.
I've gotten the report that it is not particularly laggy.
Round 1. Fight.
One of the main things you have to deal with when you're dealing with Kage as a whole is there's a lot of damage here. And honestly, the character doesn't actually have that many openings if you're choosing to attack. You can't necessarily just break Kage's defense and get a lot out of this. As a character, he can stand up to most attack styles without you actually getting much out of it. One of your best bets is, as you've just seen shown, not to specifically attempt to attack Kage per se, but to move to a position where Kage wants to attack and then have some counter ready for that position. That's why the higher level you go in these matches, in my experience, the more you'll notice that Kage players tend to leave a lot of options, you could say, on the ground, because they know that the large majority of players at that level are waiting for them to attempt to counterattack that will then be countered somehow. Depending on the character, this is harder to set up though. Laura, for example, tends to go forward in a specific way that makes it really hard, and this technically means that she has to spend a lot of time blocking stuff that Kage does without committing too heavily to any given attack style. Her best bet, particularly against this style of Kage, is to simply take damage at her own pace to make sure that she's never in a position to take too much damage from Kage at once, so that it's easier to get V-Trigger up. And it's not necessarily just this way, either V-Trigger will help her overwhelm this sort of character. So we've finished. From this point, for example, it really doesn't matter because Ami's just running out the clock, sort of. Of course, we should expect that at some point something's going to happen. Probably some, like, random Misogi, but no, apparently not. Let's just wait long enough to get the opponent into a certain mental state, and when you sense that state, or, you know, just feel like that might happen, go for the finish. That would have been a much different situation had there been one more round to go. Had the Kage player won the first match, that might not have been the strategy that Ami would want to go for. Because any mess-ups leading into the next match would have been a problem with meter. But with the possibility of just losing the match and not caring about it as much, it seemed to have worked out. As we always say on the stream, you must forward dash out of this character's cross-ups. I don't think there's a single character in the game that just deals with that anymore. I'm not sure if they buffed it, or if it simply was always that way and I didn't notice because I didn't fight good enough Kage players. But always forward dash whenever you think you're going to be crossed up by Kage. Thankfully, he's not terribly good at chasing that forward dash. That was unfortunate. Because I don't think it was even that Omni intended that to happen that way. So that was almost an unforced error, but they probably just had it in mind already. Well, back to the discussion of how do you just not take the damage? This, for example, this whole thing, trying to get out of that string too early leads to a lot of damage being taken. Getting out of the string later isn't as scary most of the time, until Kage has, like, more meter of some type. But since you must deal with a character who is going to try to jump to get big damage, you don't want to be in jumpable positions, and technically that means sometimes just sitting there and blocking hits is the answer outright. Particularly when you have a V trigger that either converts into massive damage easily, or can offer great utility in shutting down Kage's style or attempt at flowing forward. Mainly because you just don't care. The more you block, the closer you will get to having enough meter to change the matchup itself. Omni shows demonstration that there is a different option. Like, if you aren't really sure, Laura is the one that gets an option select. She can just do quarter circle forward the moment she sees Kage go into the air, and let your brain do the processing for whether or not you need to hit heavy punch or light punch after you've done it. You can train yourself to do half of one thing and then deal with it after. It's the usual, but doesn't work on that. I believe Misogi is in fact airborne from frame 1. We are told that they are a serious player and they have explicitly shown it. Which is presumably why I got to talk about lots of strategy instead of watching a lot of dancing around that was meant to feel out a specific type of, let's call it, weakness. And that means that our Nikali is going to have a relatively hard time, because the reactions required to this style of Kage are relatively untrained. Forward dashing to get out of the cross-up, as far as I know, is almost entirely untrained. Because our Kage bot doesn't actually do this that well, you have to train this against other bots, or just train it against Kage players as a whole. Well-spaced Kage projectiles, there's nothing whatsoever that Nikali can do about them, other than perfectly spaced dive kicks, I guess. And even if you do go under them with Crawling Beast, that's sort of what Kage wants you to do. And I expect this player will show us why that is, because if this match manages to go off with no interaction of Kage throwing Red Fireball and being ducked under by the Crawling Beast, I'll be really surprised. But on the other hand, this could just be an entire blow up based on the whole spacing of jumps thing. It is a decent option from the Wolf side to get into the air earlier, but that just leads to being uppercutted. Fortunately, that doesn't always lead to a lot of damage. So, there's at least some options there. The dive kick can absolutely help Nikali in this matchup, because Kage relies on opponents being properly grounded for a lot of his more damaging attacks to work fully. He wants to lock you into pressure. He wants you to be in bad situations of that type. But if you attempt to get him to spaces where he hits you but he doesn't hit you that hard, it's not better, because he's such a damaging character that if you get hit with the meaty or anything like that, you're still in a lot of trouble. But there are definitely situations you can prevent massive problems from coming up. And that sort of thing is one of it. So getting into the air here does seem to help, but it probably will only help until uppercuts start happening. Also, jumping medium punch is really effective, but again, it puts the Kage player to the point of having to do more work, so it's probably still better, because the more work you make them do, the better. I am willing to bet that that was supposed to be super. Because that's exactly the sort of place the Wolf goes for super. Oof. Tiniest spacing off there. And it then costs the match. I'm not sure that actually going into raw super from there would have been enough anyway though, so.
Round one. Fight.
So let's see what the adaptation turns out to be this time, as Kage has a fair amount of shielding options here. But Nikali being able to just uppercut out of some situations, V-reversal out of others. He can fortunately hit a lot more of Kage's attack spaces without having to think as long about it. That comes up when a character has to do the anti-air later, because the later you have to do the anti-air, the less time you can spend, let's say, thinking about it. It's very hard to explain that now that I think about it. When you have to anti-air a thing very late and can't just respond to your opponent going into the air, then there is a moment of hesitation that always gets stuck in there. And that moment can be stressful if your opponent has options in the air to do something else. If you could just uppercut though, and expect that you're either going to trade, get hit out of the air by whatever they do, or hit them, you can just respond to them leaving the ground by using uppercut, which means that any situation where you expect them to jump is a stress situation for them and not you. By contrast, if you have to wait for the perfect timing, you're looking for not only that the hitboxes are correct, not only verifying that your opponent left the ground from the point you thought they did, but that they didn't do any of their other air options, since those can be used often to hang in the air, avoid your anti-air, and cause some problem. I have no idea what this connection is going to be like, because I really should know what that flag is, but I don't. So, to the internet. That didn't help me at all. I am as often embarrassed by my lack of geography knowledge. I usually do well, but Palau? I have never seen this flag before. I don't know where Palau is at all. It's presumably somewhere in the... Okay, yes, here we go. But then even that flag doesn't look right, so I'm not going to think about it. I'm just going to hope the connection is decent enough that they get a good match. The specifics of Akuma's back heavy punch means that Akuma is one of the few characters that doesn't actually have to dash under Kage in as many situations, and doesn't have to wait as long. That move is very specifically tuned, but once Kage is closer, even that move will still fail. So it's something to keep in mind. When Kage is too close to you, if you think he's going to try to avoid footsies at all, be ready to dash forward, even if you think he's going to try to avoid footsies some other way. Most of the time, it's not going to be as bad as whatever else could have happened. That was a relatively epic interaction. But I'm told the lag is pretty bad, which becomes a bigger problem in this situation than any other. So if one is thinking of training for lag, Santir has an uphill battle because the requirement of beating this particular style of Kage in lag is having invincible uppercuts ready. Fortunately, Akuma does gain that option when using V-Trigger 1, but being left out of metered situations is kind of bad. Okay, no, that flag is in fact slightly off-center though, so it is actually Palau. Kage players mostly don't have to train for lag situations except when playing very strong footsie based characters. Because the lag, not necessarily that the lag specifically favors Kage a ton. In fact, I would go so far as to think that it actually doesn't, because the way Kage does damage is almost all combos. And pressure that can be executed without, like, specifically doing all that stuff. But it definitely does their opponents no favors, so there's not a specific need to train for their own spacing in the lag situation. If you find yourself in a laggy situation against a Kage player, your best bet is normally to reversal them off you every chance you get. Kage does have decent V-reversal bait setups, but he really doesn't want to be restricting his damage to just throwing your V-reversal. And because it is at least somewhat laggy, he does have to worry about if he's going to get it right. He's a relatively easy character to V-reversal too, because despite having a really great tick throw setup, he is not so great at overall dealing with things at max or larger ranges. He hits buttons more so to control your movement than anything else.
Kage wins.
Second Kage has appeared. We're getting close to the end of stream, but I'm not really sure whether or not it will be that. Because my experience with this matchup is that it's usually a blow up in one direction. Because this is exactly the character type I was speaking of before. If this is laggy, I would go so far as to say that the Kage player is at disadvantage. Now, you can resolve this somewhat by just being more aggressive and hoping for the best. But because Karin's damage, especially if you try to cover certain things with stronger moves, can be so high, it's volatile to say the least, but it gets really bad when you can't tell the spacing Karin is at. And this is particularly true because she has so many ways of controlling the spacing long enough. Yeah, we got jump backs. I'm not sure what that was about. But it's the same thing here. Technically, Karin mostly cares about just V-reversaling her way out of the situations as often as possible. Her V-reversal puts Kage far enough away that he has to worry more so than she does. And she really doesn't even have to chase this character. Like, Kage has so few proper approaches to Karin that aren't in some way risky. Even the V trigger teleport is not really going to deal with a lot. But our main problem from our Karin side here is she won't necessarily think to V-reversal the first hit, the quickest hit. Generally it's, oh, I'm waiting until something more has happened, where you don't really want to do that against Kage in general, especially if your V-reversal is a knockdown.
Round 2. Fight.
Because yes, again, while he has like that walking up jab situation, a footsie character has so much control over that that it never comes up. You just V-reversal him almost immediately. Similarly, right, as noted, this is a chase situation, but it's not a chase situation that's required in any way from Karin's side. Chose to go for the uppercut instead. This is compounded by the fact that not only is Karin relatively good at building up V-meter without actually having to defend, she also has more options for good crush counter spacings than a lot of other characters do in this matchup. So you don't really worry about the fact of, do I have V-meter or not? You just attempt to dominate the matchup as much as possible while not necessarily chasing down your opponent. Because you see, when that happens, you've moved to the point where they want you to be there. They want you to be there so that they can jump at you. You don't need to corner guard Kage from close at all, because he really isn't going to do anything. Whereas he has a lot more moves that will very quickly convert into big damage. If you stand here, you can do that. And of course he can get out of the situation, but you, again, mostly don't care. So by the principle of have I won this match, you should be thinking in this situation, I have already won this matchup, and my opponent's main job right now is to run away from me. But she can also do that, which is basically chasing you across the entire screen almost immediately. A little too close though. There we go.
Kage wins.
Well, it is at least getting dragged out to already be past the end of stream, or the relatively time that I would be attempting to end the stream. Playing against players like this is a matter of not necessarily patience, but the ability to blank your mind once you have gotten to the point of, conceptually, I have won this matchup already. Because it's what you need in order to understand how to get into their head, get under their skin. The actions your opponent is taking don't have a meaning every time. They're often just there to make you want to do something else, to distract you from what the matchup requires of you. Basically like that. That situation was lost a few interactions back because Kage's overhead stomp kick can always be reversed. He has no bait out of it, it's too slow. Okay. I'm not believing they're a serious player anymore. But I guess you can't really say it is a incorrect thing if it can get a person to chase you. And that's what I meant about blanking your mind. If you realize that that's what your opponent wants to do, what they think is going to work, just stop. There's literally no reason to fight that because it's not a fight anymore. The thing that is happening on screen is not in any way a contest of spacing, timing, accuracy. It's not a contest of anything. Your opponent is moving away from you without you taking an action. In fact, your big problem is that they're giving you a massive amount of time to study them, whereas you're basically not taking anything whatsoever in terms of damage or threat, unless you don't take that chance to study them. But that brings us to the end of the stream for tonight. The lounge will stay open, though I can't say who will stay in it versus not. You can join us tomorrow for the Tuesday melt. And generally, we won't be having as much content this week. Wednesday will be off for various reasons. Thursday is probably our Feeling Thursday lounge. And Friday, once again, no content. We'll be back with another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge on a Monday. And some stuff over the weekend, depending on how Combo Breaker goes. You can find all of our bots at 2-mk.org. And all of our Twitter information, 2_MK_FGC. This has been Rillian, 142MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.